Every Sunday morning, at exactly 9 o'clock, a silver pickup truck slowly turned into the parking lot of Maple Grove Nursing Home. It had done so nearly every week. For the past 15 years, the security guard didn't even need to check the visitor log anymore. He simply smiled. "Morning, Walter." Walter Morgan smiled back. "Morning, Ben. You brought cinnamon rolls again." Walter lifted a paper box from the passenger seat, fresh from Miller's bakery. Ben laughed. "They're going to spoil those residents." Walter shrugged. "They've earned it." Walter was 76 years old, a retired high school history teacher, a widower, a grandfather, and perhaps the most faithful visitor Maple Grove had ever known. The unusual thing was that Walter didn't have a single relative living there. Not one. People often asked him why he came. His answer never changed, because everyone deserves someone to ask. "How has your week been?" 15 years earlier, Walter had visited the nursing home to see his own mother. She had lived there for only 6 months before passing away peacefully. During those visits, he noticed something he could never forget. Every Sunday, some rooms filled with laughter, flowers, children, grandchildren, birthday balloons. Meanwhile, other rooms remained painfully quiet. Residents stared through windows, watching families walk past, hoping someone might accidentally be coming for them. Most weren't. On the day his mother died, Walter quietly made himself a promise. He stood beside her empty bed and whispered, "I'll keep visiting, not just for you, for everyone." And he did, every Sunday, without fail. Snowstorms, summer heat, heavy rain, even after knee surgery, even after catching pneumonia one winter, Walter still came, sometimes using a cane, sometimes walking slowly, but always arriving. Inside Maple Grove, the staff knew his routine by heart. First, he visited Mrs. Evelyn Carter, 94 years old, nearly blind. She could no longer recognize faces, but somehow, she always recognized Walter's voice. "There you are." She smiled. "I was beginning to think Sunday forgot us." Walter gently laughed. "I wouldn't let Sunday do that." Next came Mr. Frank Douglas, a Korean War veteran. Every week, he challenged Walter to chess. Every week, Frank claimed he'd let Walter win. Every week, Walter insisted that wasn't true. The argument had lasted 11 years. Neither man intended to end it. Then came Mrs. Louise, who always forgot breakfast, but never forgot to ask about Walter's granddaughter. Even though Emily had moved across the country years ago, Walter answered every question as though it were the first time. Because he knew, kindness sometimes meant repeating joy. By noon, Walter had visited nearly 20 residents. He remembered birthdays, favorite songs, children's names, old careers, wedding anniversaries. He even knew which rooms liked tulips and which preferred sunflowers. One of the younger nurses watched him from the hallway. Her name was Hannah, only 26. She had worked there less than 6 months. She quietly asked another nurse, "Does he really come every Sunday?" The older nurse smiled. "Every single one. No holidays. No holidays. No birthdays. He celebrates them here." Hannah looked down the hallway. "Why?" The older nurse answered softly. "Because some people make promises that become part of who they are." Just before leaving, Walter always sat for 15 minutes in the activity room. There stood one old wooden chair. Near the window, the sunlight reached it every afternoon. It had become Walter's chair over the years. Residents joked that no one else was allowed to sit there. Walter always laughed. The chair belongs to whoever needs it. That particular Sunday, Walter carried his coffee into the room, still smiling after another wonderful morning. Then, he stopped. Someone was already sitting in his chair. Not a resident, not a nurse, a little girl, perhaps 10 years old, long brown hair tied into a simple ponytail, blue sneakers, a faded yellow backpack resting beside her feet. She looked toward the garden outside, completely silent. Walter hesitated. He didn't want to interrupt, so he quietly chose another chair across the room. The little girl finally noticed him. She stood immediately. "I'm sorry. I didn't know someone sat here." Walter smiled warmly. "Oh, it's not really mine. You don't have to move." But she remained standing. "My grandma says, you always sit there." Walter looked surprised. "Your grandma knows me." The girl nodded. "Everybody knows you." Walter smiled. "What's your name?" She answered softly, "Emma." "And who's your grandmother?" The little girl pointed toward room 214. "Margaret Collins." Walter immediately smiled. "Margaret, the retired librarian." Emma nodded happily. "You know her?" Walter chuckled. "She's beaten me at crossword puzzles for 7 years." Emma laughed for the first time. "My grandma says you're terrible at crossword puzzles." Walter placed a hand over his heart. "Well, she's not entirely wrong." The room filled with gentle laughter. Then, Emma became quiet again. She looked toward the hallway, as though waiting for someone. Walter noticed. "Are you waiting for your parents?" Emma slowly shook her head. "No, for someone else." Another quiet shake. Then she whispered, "I'm waiting to see if Grandpa comes today." Walter smiled gently. "Is your grandfather inside?" Emma lowered her eyes. "He doesn't live here." Walter frowned slightly. "Then where is he?" The little girl's voice became almost too soft to hear. "I've never met him." Walter's smile slowly faded. Emma looked toward the empty doorway. "My mom says he left before I was born." So, she hugged her backpack tightly. "I thought, if I waited long enough, maybe he'd come looking for me." The room suddenly felt much quieter. Walter didn't know what to say. Some heartbreaks were simply too honest for easy answers. After several moments, Walter quietly moved his own chair beside hers. Not across from her, beside her, so they could both look out the same window. Neither spoke. They simply watched the birds in the garden. Finally, Walter smiled gently. "You know, I've learned something after all these years." Emma looked up. "What?" Walter answered softly. "Sometimes, the people we're waiting for never come." Emma lowered her eyes. "But," he continued, "sometimes, someone else does." Emma looked at him, confused, curious, hopeful. Walter didn't realize it yet, but that Sunday, the promise he had made 15 years earlier, was about to become much bigger than he had ever imagined. The following Sunday, Walter arrived at Maple Grove just as he always did. 9 o'clock. A box of fresh cinnamon rolls rested on the passenger seat. The security guard, Ben, waved as the silver pickup rolled into the parking lot. "Morning, Walter." Walter smiled. "Morning." Ben looked toward the activity room windows. "I think someone beat you to your chair again." Walter laughed. "I was beginning to think that might happen." Inside, everything felt comfortably familiar. Mrs. Evelyn wanted to hear another story about Walter's teaching days. Frank insisted on another game of chess. Louise asked whether Emily still preferred blueberry pie. Walter answered every question with the same patience he always had. But, every few minutes, his eyes drifted toward the hallway, toward the activity room, toward the chair beside the window. At exactly 2 o'clock, Walter carried 2 paper cups of hot chocolate into the room. Emma was already there. She wore the same faded yellow backpack, the same blue sneakers. She sat quietly in the wooden chair, watching the front entrance through the large glass doors. She looked up when Walter entered. "You came?" Walter smiled. "I said I would." Emma looked at the second cup. "Is that for me?" Walter nodded. "Only if your grandmother says hot chocolate is allowed." Emma grinned. She already did. Walter laughed. "So you planned this?" Emma shrugged. "Maybe." They sat together, watching people come and go. Families hugged grandparents. Children ran down the hallway carrying balloons. Visitors signed the guest book. Emma watched every face carefully. Every time the front door opened, her shoulders lifted slightly. Every time it closed, they fell again. Walter noticed, but he didn't mention it. Some hopes needed kindness more than questions. After several minutes, Emma quietly asked, "Can I ask you something?" "Of course. Why do you come here?" Walter smiled. "I used to visit my mother." Emma nodded. "But she's gone now." "Yes. So why didn't you stop?" Walter looked toward the garden. A robin landed near the bird feeder. It would have been easy to stop. He paused. "But one day, I noticed something." Emma listened carefully. Walter continued. "I realized some people here didn't have anyone. They waited every Sunday. They watched every car that pulled into the parking lot. They smiled every time the elevator opened. And every Sunday, some of them went to bed disappointed." Emma slowly lowered her eyes. She understood that feeling. Walter gently sipped his hot chocolate. "So I thought, if I had enough time to visit one person, maybe I had enough time to visit 20. Emma smiled. That's a lot of grandparents. Walter laughed. It certainly keeps me busy. A soft voice interrupted them. Busy enough to forget your chess rematch. Frank stood in the doorway, holding a chessboard. Walter smiled. I was hoping you'd forgotten. Frank snorted. I've waited all week. Emma looked excited. You play chess? Frank pretended to look offended. Young lady, I've been defeating this man for 11 years. Walter shook his head. That's not exactly how I remember it. Emma giggled. Frank set the board on the table. Would you like to watch? Emma nodded enthusiastically. I've never learned. Walter smiled. Then today, you'll be the referee. The game lasted nearly an hour. Frank explained every move. Walter intentionally slowed down. Not because he needed more time. Because Emma asked questions. Lots of questions. What does that piece do? Why can't the king move there? Why would anyone sacrifice a queen? Frank answered every one, patiently, as though teaching his own granddaughter. When the match finally ended, Frank sighed dramatically. I suppose I let you win again. Walter laughed. You've been saying that since 2014. Emma looked back and forth between them. I think you're both lying. The two old men burst into laughter. Word spread quickly through Maple Grove. The quiet little girl in the window chair was smiling. The nurses noticed first, then the residents, then even the kitchen staff. One afternoon, Hannah whispered to another nurse. She hardly spoke last week. The older nurse nodded. Now listen. Down the hallway, Emma's laughter echoed through the building. Soft, bright, completely unexpected. That evening, Margaret Collins invited Walter into her room. Emma sat nearby drawing birds in a notebook. Margaret smiled warmly. I owe you a thank you. Walter shook his head. For what? Margaret looked toward Emma. She hasn't smiled like this since her mother died. Walter froze. I'm sorry. I didn't know. Margaret nodded gently. Most people don't. Walter looked toward Emma, still drawing, still humming quietly to herself. How long ago? Almost 2 years. Walter slowly sat down. And her father? Margaret sighed. He left long before Emma was born. So it's just the two of you. Margaret smiled. Just the two of us. She hesitated. At least, it used to be. Walter looked confused. What do you mean? Margaret gently rubbed her hands together. The doctors found something last month. Walter's expression changed. I'm very sorry. Margaret nodded. I don't have much time left. The room became painfully quiet. Margaret looked toward Emma. She doesn't know yet. Walter followed her gaze. Emma was coloring a small robin blue, completely unaware of the conversation. Margaret whispered, I'm not afraid of dying. Walter listened. I'm afraid of leaving her alone. Walter didn't know how to respond. No words felt big enough. Finally, he reached across the small table, placed his hand gently over Margaret's. You won't face that fear alone. Margaret looked into his eyes. Something about Walter's voice made her believe him. As Walter prepared to leave, Emma walked beside him to the front entrance. She looked up. Will you come next Sunday? Walter smiled. I've been coming every Sunday for 15 years. Emma nodded thoughtfully. I know. Then she quietly asked, Can I save your chair again? Walter laughed. You already have. Emma frowned. What do you mean? Walter gently pointed toward the wooden chair by the window. It stopped being my chair the day you sat in it. Emma smiled, the biggest smile Walter had seen yet. As Walter climbed into his pickup, he looked back toward the building. Emma stood in the window, waving. For the first time in years, someone was waiting for Walter to arrive each Sunday. He smiled all the way home, but deep inside, Margaret's words stayed with him. I'm afraid of leaving her alone. Walter couldn't stop thinking about them. He didn't know why. He only knew that sometimes life quietly places someone in your path, long before you understand the reason. The following week, Walter couldn't stop thinking about Margaret, or Emma's. Margaret's quiet words echoed through his mind. I'm afraid of leaving her alone. He had spent 15 years comforting strangers, listening, encouraging, holding trembling hands through difficult days. But this felt different. For the first time in many years, he wasn't simply witnessing someone's loneliness. He was watching a child slowly walk toward it. Sunday arrived. The familiar silver pickup rolled into Maple Grove. But before Walter could step inside, Hannah, the young nurse, hurried toward him. Her smile was gone. Mr. Morgan. Walter immediately sensed something was wrong. Is Margaret all right? Hannah hesitated. She had a difficult night. Walter quietly nodded. I'll go see her. Room 214 felt unusually quiet. The curtains were half open. Morning sunlight rested softly across the blanket. Margaret looked much weaker than the week before. But when she saw Walter, she smiled. I was wondering if Sunday remembered me. Walter gently pulled a chair beside her bed. I told you, Sunday never forgets. Emma sat near the window, drawing in her notebook again. This time, there were 3 people in every picture. A little girl, an elderly woman, and an old man wearing a baseball cap. Walter smiled. I see I've been promoted. Emma looked up. You have? To what? My Sunday grandpa. Walter laughed softly. I didn't know that position was available. Emma shrugged. It is now. Margaret watched them quietly. Tears filled her eyes. Not tears of sadness, tears of relief. For the first time in months, Emma was laughing again. Later that afternoon, Emma joined an arts and crafts activity with other children visiting grandparents. Walter remained in Margaret's room. Neither spoke for a while. Finally, Margaret broke the silence. The doctors were honest. Walter looked toward her. They don't think I'll see Christmas. The words settled heavily in the room. Walter slowly lowered his head. I'm so sorry. Margaret smiled gently. I've had 78 beautiful years. I'm grateful. She paused. But Emma, her voice trembled. She deserves so many more. Walter listened quietly. Margaret reached toward the bedside drawer. She removed a worn blue folder. Its corners had softened with age. Inside were photographs, birth certificates, school papers, medical records, and one small envelope. Across the front, Margaret placed the folder on Walter's lap. I need someone to know her. Walter looked confused. You have family. Margaret slowly shook her head. My husband passed away 12 years ago. My daughter, she paused, Emma's mother, died in a car accident. Walter nodded gently. And Emma's father. Margaret looked toward the window. I've searched for years. No calls, no letters, no birthdays, nothing. Walter quietly closed the folder. I'm sorry. Margaret smiled sadly. I stopped being angry a long time ago. She looked toward the hallway where Emma's laughter echoed faintly. I'm running out of time. For several moments, the only sound came from children laughing down the hall. Finally, Margaret asked the question she had been carrying for weeks. Walter, he looked up. If something happens to me, will you? She stopped, unable to continue. Walter gently waited. Sometimes, people needed silence more than encouragement. Margaret finally whispered, will you promise that Emma won't feel forgotten? Walter's heart tightened. He wasn't expecting those words. He had assumed she wanted financial help, legal advice, someone to contact. Instead, she asked for something much simpler and far more difficult. Walter slowly reached across the bed. He took Margaret's frail hand, then answered without hesitation. I promise. Margaret searched his eyes. You mean it? Walter nodded. With everything I have. She closed her eyes. A single tear rolled down her cheek. Thank you. Walter squeezed her hand gently. You've carried this burden alone long enough. That afternoon, Emma returned carrying a paper flower she had made. She proudly handed it to Walter. For your porch. Walter smiled. I'll put it where I drink my coffee. Emma grinned. So you'll think about me. Walter laughed. I already do. Before leaving, Emma suddenly asked, can I come see your house someday? Walter smiled. I think you'd like my garden. You have flowers. Lots. Birds. Too many. She giggled. And squirrels. Walter sighed dramatically. The squirrels think they own the place. Emma laughed louder than ever. I want to meet those squirrels. Margaret watched from her bed. Her smile never faded. She quietly whispered to herself, maybe everything is going to be all right. Over the next month, Walter's Sunday visits slowly changed. He still played chess with Frank, still brought cinnamon rolls, still visited every resident. But every afternoon at 2, he and Emma sat by the window. Sometimes they colored, sometimes they watched birds, sometimes they simply counted the red cars driving past. Neither realized those ordinary afternoons were becoming the happiest memories of Emma's childhood. One rainy Sunday, Emma reached into her backpack. She pulled out a folded piece of paper. I made something. Walter opened it carefully. Across the page, a child's handwriting read, "People I can count on. Grandma, Mr. Walter." There were no other names. Walter quietly folded the paper. His throat tightened. He smiled, but only because he didn't trust himself to speak. That evening, as Walter drove home through the rain, he kept thinking about Emma's list. Only 2 names, and one of them was 76 years old. For the first time in 15 years, Walter realized his promise at Maple Grove was no longer just about visiting lonely strangers. It had quietly become a promise to one little girl who had already begun calling him family. Autumn arrived earlier than expected. The maple trees surrounding Maple Grove had already begun dropping their golden leaves. Walter noticed something else. The hallways felt quieter. Margaret no longer came to the activity room. She no longer joined bingo nights or afternoon sing-alongs. Most days, she remained in room 214, resting, waiting, growing weaker. Walter continued coming every Sunday. As always, fresh cinnamon rolls, fresh coffee, fresh conversations, but before visiting anyone else, he now walked directly to room 214. Emma had begun waiting outside the door. She always smiled when she saw him. "You came," Walter smiled back. "I told you. I'll keep coming." One Sunday, Emma held something behind her back. "I made you a surprise." Walter pretended to guess. "A chocolate cake." Emma giggled. "No, a puppy." She laughed harder. "No, a squirrel wearing a cowboy hat." Emma nearly fell over laughing. "You think about squirrels too much." Walter smiled. "You're probably right." Emma proudly handed him a small handmade bracelet, blue and yellow beads, with one tiny white bead in the middle. Walter carefully slipped it onto his wrist. "It fits perfectly." Emma smiled proudly. "So you'll remember me." Walter looked into her eyes. "I couldn't forget you if I tried." Inside the room, Margaret watched everything quietly. She looked thinner, her breathing slower, but seeing Emma laugh still brought light into her tired eyes. Later, after Emma joined an afternoon music class, Margaret motioned for Walter to come closer. "I don't think I have much time." Walter gently shook his head. "You don't know that." Margaret smiled softly. "I think I do." She reached into the bedside drawer. Inside lay a faded photograph. It showed a much younger Margaret, standing beside her daughter. A little girl sat on her mother's shoulders. Emma, only 3 years old. Walter studied the picture. "They look so happy." "They were," Margaret whispered. "My daughter loved being a mother." She slowly turned the photograph. On the back, her daughter had written, "Mom, if anything ever happens to me, please teach Emma that love never disappears." Walter quietly read the sentence twice, then carefully handed the photograph back. Margaret smiled. "I've tried." Walter nodded. "You have. But now," she looked toward the hallway, "I need someone else to keep teaching her." Walter understood. Without another word, he reached for her hand. "You don't have to ask again. I gave you my promise." Margaret squeezed his hand gently. "I know." That afternoon, Emma convinced Walter to help her plant a small flower outside the nursing home. The maintenance supervisor found them a tiny patch of soil near the garden. "What are we planting?" Walter asked. Emma smiled. "A sunflower." Walter looked surprised. "Why a sunflower?" Emma carefully covered the roots with dirt. "Grandma says they always turn toward the light." Walter quietly smiled. "She's right." Emma looked up. "I want to be like that." Walter gently brushed dirt from her sleeve. "I think you already are." Over the next 2 weeks, Margaret's health declined quickly. She slept more, ate less, spoke only a few words each day. The nurses became gentler. The doctors visited more often. Everyone understood. Time was becoming precious. Late one Wednesday evening, Walter's telephone rang. He answered immediately. "Hello?" It was Hannah. "Mr. Morgan, I think you should come." Walter didn't ask questions. He simply grabbed his coat and drove. The nursing home looked different at night. The hallways were dim, the conversations softer, the world somehow quieter. Hannah met him near room 214. "She's been asking for you." Walter nodded, then slowly stepped inside. Margaret opened her eyes as he approached. A faint smile appeared. "I knew you'd come." Walter sat beside her bed. "I'm here." Emma slept quietly in a chair nearby, still holding the stuffed rabbit Walter had won for her at the county fair a month earlier. Walter looked toward her, then back at Margaret. "She'll wake soon." Margaret gently shook her head. Let her sleep. For several minutes, neither spoke. The room remained peaceful. Finally, Margaret whispered, "I've been thinking." Walter leaned closer. "I believe God sent you before I even knew I needed you." Walter lowered his eyes. "I think he sent Emma to me too." Margaret smiled. "I was hoping you'd say that." A little after midnight, Emma slowly woke. She rubbed her eyes, then hurried to her grandmother's bedside. "Grandma," Margaret smiled weakly. "Come here, sweetheart." Emma climbed carefully onto the bed, taking her grandmother's hand. Margaret looked toward Walter. Then, without saying anything, she reached for his hand too. Slowly, she placed Emma's small hand into Walter's. Her fingers rested over both of theirs. She smiled. It was the peaceful smile of someone whose greatest worry had finally become lighter. Her voice was barely above a whisper. "Walter," he leaned close. "Don't let her forget how deeply she's loved." Walter's eyes filled with tears. "I won't. I promise." Margaret turned toward Emma. "My beautiful girl." Emma tried to smile, but tears already streamed down her face. "I'll always be with you." Emma shook her head desperately. "No, please don't go." Margaret gently brushed Emma's hair back. "Whenever you see sunflowers, think of me. They always find the light." Those were the last complete words she ever spoke. She quietly closed her eyes, still holding both of their hands. The room became still, peaceful, sacred. Walter lowered his head. Emma buried her face against his shoulder. He wrapped one arm around her. Neither cried loudly. Some goodbyes were simply too deep for words. 3 days later, the small church in Ashton Ridge held Margaret Collins' memorial service. The chapel wasn't full, only a handful of neighbors, several nurses from Maple Grove, a few former library co-workers, and Walter, sitting beside Emma in the front pew. She held his hand through the entire service, never once letting go. After the service, the lawyer handling Margaret's estate quietly approached Walter. "Mr. Morgan." Walter nodded. "There are a few matters Mrs. Collins asked us to discuss with you." Walter looked confused. "With me?" The lawyer nodded. "She prepared everything several months ago." Walter glanced toward Emma. She stood quietly beside the sunflower planted outside the church, looking very small, very alone. He had a feeling the promise he made beside Margaret's bed was only the beginning. 3 days after Margaret's funeral, Walter found himself sitting inside a small law office on Main Street. Emma sat quietly beside him. The little girl held the stuffed rabbit Walter had won for her at the county fair. She hadn't said much all morning. Grief often made children quieter than adults realized. Across the table, Attorney Susan Ellis carefully opened a brown folder. "Mrs. Collins left very clear instructions." Walter nodded politely. "I assumed everything would go to Emma." Susan smiled gently. "It does." She paused. "But there's something else." Susan removed a handwritten letter. "The first part is for Emma." She smiled at the little girl. "Your grandma wanted you to read it when you're older." Emma carefully hugged the envelope. She didn't open it. "Not yet. Some gift. Needed time." Susan reached for another envelope. Across the front, Margaret had written, "For Walter Morgan." Walter quietly accepted it. His hands trembled slightly. He unfolded the paper. Margaret's familiar handwriting greeted him one final time. "Dear Walter, by now you've already kept your first promise. You came when Emma needed someone most. Thank you." Walter swallowed quietly. He continued reading. "There is something I never asked you because I was afraid it wasn't fair. But now, I have no choice except to trust your heart." Walter slowly looked toward Emma. She sat swinging her feet beneath the chair, still hugging the stuffed rabbit, completely unaware. Walter continued, "If Emma ever feels alone, please remind her that family isn't always found at birth. Sometimes, God sends it later." Walter gently closed his eyes. Margaret had always known exactly how to reach his heart. Susan quietly folded her hands. "There is one legal matter we should discuss." Walter looked up. "The court has appointed temporary guardianship." Walter nodded. "I expected that." Susan continued, "But unless another suitable family member is found, Emma will likely enter foster care." The room became completely silent. Walter slowly turned toward Emma. She was coloring quietly in a small notebook, completely unaware that strangers were deciding where she might live. His heart tightened. Susan spoke softly. We've spent the last several weeks searching. There are no grandparents, no aunts, no uncles, no legal guardian. Walter lowered his head. So, she'd be alone. Susan nodded. At least for now. Walter remained silent for a long time. He had spent 15 years visiting lonely people. Now, loneliness had found someone much younger. Emma suddenly looked up. Mr. Walter. Walter smiled gently. Yes, can I ask you something? Of course. She hesitated. Will I still get to see the sunflower? Walter felt something break inside him. He looked toward Susan, then back to Emma. As often as you want. Emma smiled. Good. It's Grandma's favorite. That evening, Walter drove home more slowly than usual. The road seemed longer, the silence heavier. When he reached his little farmhouse, he didn't go inside. Instead, he sat on the porch, watching the sun disappear behind the hills. The bracelet Emma had made still rested around his wrist. He gently touched the tiny white bead, then quietly whispered, Elena, I could really use your advice. He closed his eyes and remembered something his wife used to say whenever life became complicated. When love asks something difficult of you, it usually means it's worth doing. Walter smiled through tears. Even after 8 years, he could still hear her voice. The next morning, Walter drove back to Maple Grove, not because it was Sunday, because he wanted to see Emma. He found her sitting beside the sunflower they had planted together. Its bright yellow petals faced the morning sun. Emma smiled when she saw him. You came back. Walter laughed. It's only Tuesday. I know. She looked down. I just wasn't sure. Walter sat beside her. For several minutes, neither of them spoke. Finally, Emma quietly asked, do kids have to leave when their grandma dies? Walter answered honestly. Sometimes. Emma nodded. I heard the nurses talking. Walter wasn't surprised. Children often heard more than adults imagine. She looked toward the sunflower. I'm scared. Walter gently placed his hand over hers. I know. Emma's voice trembled. What if nobody wants me? Walter didn't answer immediately, because some questions deserved the truth. Finally, he smiled. I think anyone who really knows you already does. Emma leaned against his shoulder. Neither of them noticed Hannah watching quietly from the doorway. She wiped away a tear. Later that afternoon, Walter met with Susan again. I have a question. She smiled. I'm listening. Walter took a slow breath. What would it take for someone my age to become Emma's guardian? Susan looked genuinely surprised. You mean legally? Walter nodded. Yes. She hesitated. Walter, you're 76. I know. The court would have concerns. I understand. You'd have home inspections, medical evaluations, financial reviews. Walter smiled. I expected all that. Susan leaned forward. Why would you do this? Walter looked out the office window, then answered quietly. Because 15 years ago, I promised my mother I'd never let lonely people feel forgotten. He paused. I didn't realize. One of them would be 10 years old. Susan's eyes filled with tears. That evening, Walter opened the old cedar chest in his bedroom. Inside lay dozens of family photographs, Emily's childhood drawings, letters from Elena, birthday cards, memories collected over a lifetime. He smiled, then quietly walked into the room that had become nothing more than storage. Old books, unused furniture, boxes. He looked around, then whispered to himself, I think this room has been waiting for someone. As he opened the curtains, warm afternoon sunlight filled the room. Dust danced gently through the air. Walter smiled. For the first time in years, the old farmhouse no longer felt too quiet. It felt as though it had been preparing for a little girl, long before either of them knew it. The paperwork began the following Monday. Walter had expected it to be difficult. He simply hadn't expected it to be so long. Medical examinations, financial records, home inspections, background checks, interviews, references. Every form seemed to ask the same silent question. Can a 76-year-old widower really raise a 10-year-old girl? Walter couldn't blame them. He had asked himself the same question. More than once, Attorney Susan Ellis spread another stack of documents across her desk. I'll be honest with you. Walter smiled. I'd expect nothing less. The court will look closely at your age. Walter nodded. I know. They'll ask who will care for Emma if something happens to you. I've thought about that. They'll ask whether you can keep up with a child. Walter laughed softly. I may not run very fast, but I can still read bedtime stories. Susan couldn't help smiling. The next week, a social worker named Rebecca Collins visited Walter's farmhouse. She wasn't there to judge. She was there to understand. Walter welcomed her inside. The house smelled of fresh bread. A pot of vegetable soup simmered quietly on the stove. Family photographs lined the hallway. Books filled nearly every shelf. The little bedroom Walter had cleaned only days earlier had transformed completely. Fresh yellow curtains, a white quilt with tiny sunflowers stitched across it, a bookshelf filled with children's classics, a small desk beside the window, and resting on the pillow, Emma's stuffed rabbit. Rebecca smiled. You've been preparing. Walter looked around the room. I suppose. My heart started before my hands did. Rebecca carefully walked through the house. She checked smoke detectors, emergency contacts, medicine cabinets. She asked practical questions. Who lives nearby? My daughter Emily. How far away? 20 minutes. Does she know about your decision? Walter smiled. She's the first person I called. Rebecca looked surprised. And what did she say? Walter laughed. She said, Dad, I was wondering how long it would take before you brought another child into this family. Rebecca smiled warmly. She wasn't surprised. Walter shook his head. My daughter grew up watching me visit Maple Grove. She knows I've never been very good at walking away from people. A few days later, Rebecca visited Maple Grove. She wanted to understand who Walter really was. Not through paperwork, through people. She began with Hannah. The young nurse smiled before Rebecca had even finished asking. You want to know about Mr. Morgan? Rebecca nodded. What kind of man is he? Hannah laughed softly. The kind who remembers everyone's birthday, even when they forget their own. She continued, I've worked in healthcare for 6 years. I've met thousands of visitors. Families come when it's convenient. Some come once a month. Some never come. She smiled. Walter came every Sunday. For 15 years. Without missing one. Rebecca quietly wrote something in her notebook. Then she spoke with Frank. The old Korean War veteran still insisted Walter cheated at chess. Rebecca asked, would you trust Walter with a child? Frank looked almost offended. Young lady, I trusted him with my last years. I'd trust him with anything. Mrs. Evelyn, though nearly blind, recognized Walter's name immediately. Oh, my Sunday boy. Rebecca smiled. What makes him special? Evelyn answered without hesitation. He never rushed. Rebecca looked puzzled. Evelyn smiled gently. When you get old, you learn that people who stay 5 extra minutes love you differently. Rebecca spent nearly 4 hours at Maple Grove. Every conversation sounded different, yet every answer pointed toward the same truth. Walter Morgan had quietly become family, to people who shared neither his name nor his blood. Word soon spread through Ashtonridge. Walter was trying to become Emma's guardian. No one had expected the town's reaction. The owner of Miller's Bakery arrived first. He walked into Susan Ellis's office carrying an envelope. I'd like to write a reference. Susan smiled. Of course. He nodded. Walter has bought cinnamon rolls every Sunday for 15 years. She laughed. I've heard. He always bought extra, for people nobody else remembered. The town librarian came next. Then Walter's former students. Then neighbors. Then church members. Letters arrived every day. Some were typed. Some handwritten. Some only a few sentences long. But each told the same story. Walter had quietly changed someone's life, without expecting anything in return. One afternoon, Susan placed a stack of letters on Walter's kitchen table. There are 87. Walter blinked. 87. She nodded. And they're still coming. Walter looked overwhelmed. I didn't ask for this. Susan smiled. I know. You didn't have to. That Sunday, Walter visited Maple Grove as usual. Emma ran down the hallway the moment she saw him. I have something. She proudly held up a crayon drawing. Walter studied it carefully. There stood a little farmhouse, a sunflower garden, a little girl, an old man, and a golden retriever. Walter laughed. We don't have a dog. Emma grinned. Not yet. Walter smiled. So you've already planned my future. Emma nodded seriously. Someone has to. Walter folded the drawing carefully. I'll frame this. Emma looked surprised. Really? Absolutely. It'll go right by the front door, so everyone knows who lives there. Walter looked into her hopeful eyes, then quietly answered, I hope so. A week later, the family court hearing finally arrived. Walter wore the same navy suit he had worn to Emily's wedding. His hands felt colder than usual. Emma sat beside him, swinging her feet gently beneath the bench. She reached over and slipped her small hand into his. Walter squeezed it gently. Neither needed to speak. The judge entered, a kind woman in her 60s, Judge Helen Morrison. She carefully reviewed the thick case file, then looked toward Walter. Mr. Morgan. Walter stood. I've reviewed your application. She paused. You understand that becoming a guardian at your age is highly unusual. Walter nodded. Yes, Your Honor. The judge folded her hands. So I have only one question. The courtroom became completely silent. She looked directly into Walter's eyes. Why? Walter stood quietly for several moments, then answered in a voice barely above a whisper. Because, when I met Emma, she was waiting for a grandfather, who was never coming. He paused. I couldn't become the grandfather she lost, but perhaps I could become the one God sent instead. Not another sound could be heard inside the courtroom. Even the court reporter stopped typing for a moment. The judge lowered her eyes, slowly closed the file, then smiled. The courtroom remained completely silent. Walter still stood before the judge. Emma's small hand rested gently inside his. Judge Helen Morrison looked down at the thick case file one last time. Then, she quietly removed her reading glasses. Everyone waited. The judge smiled softly. Mr. Morgan, I've served on this bench for 23 years. Walter nodded respectfully. I've approved many guardianships, many adoptions, and many foster placements. She paused. But this case is different. Walter remained silent. The judge looked toward Emma. The little girl sat perfectly still. Her feet barely touched the floor. She held the stuffed rabbit tightly against her chest. Judge Morrison smiled warmly. Emma, the little girl looked up. Do you know why we're here today? Emma nodded slowly. I think so. Can you tell me? Emma hesitated, then quietly answered, because grown-ups have to decide if I get to keep my grandpa. The room grew quiet once again. The judge swallowed gently. She looked back toward Walter, then toward the attorneys. Finally, she folded her hands. There is something I'd like to say. No one interrupted. When I was 12 years old, my own grandfather wasn't related to me. Walter looked surprised. The judge smiled. My biological grandfather passed away before I was born. She continued. The man I called Grandpa was my next-door neighbor. He taught me to ride a bicycle. He attended every school play. He walked me down the aisle on my wedding day. She paused. Love doesn't always begin with a family tree. Walter felt tears forming. The judge looked toward Emma. Sometimes, it begins with a promise. She opened the case file one final time, then spoke clearly. After reviewing the evidence, the home study, the medical evaluations, the recommendations from Maple Grove Nursing Home, the testimony of the social workers, and the extraordinary support from this community, she smiled. The court finds that placement with Walter Morgan serves the best interests of Emma Collins. She gently tapped her gavel. Guardianship is granted. For one brief moment, no one moved. No one spoke. Emma looked toward Walter, then whispered, What does that mean? Walter smiled through tears. It means... He knelt beside her. You get to come home. Emma stared at him. As your granddaughter. Walter nodded. If you'll have me. Emma threw her arms around his neck. I already did. The courtroom quietly filled with applause. Even the bailiff smiled. Attorney Susan Ellis wiped away tears. Rebecca, the social worker, quietly closed her notebook. For the first time in months, every question had finally found its answer. Outside the courthouse, reporters weren't waiting. There were no cameras, no headlines, only neighbors, church friends, former students, and several nurses from Maple Grove. Frank had insisted on coming, using his cane. I wasn't about to miss this. Walter laughed. I figured you might say that. Frank grinned. I still think I let you win at chess. Walter shook his head. You'll never admit the truth. Emma looked back and forth between them. You two argue like brothers. Frank smiled. We practically are. Before leaving, Hannah walked over carrying a small paper bag. "This is for Emma." Emma opened it carefully. Inside was a tiny wooden birdhouse, painted bright yellow. Hannah smiled. The residents made it together. Emma looked surprised. "For me?" Hannah nodded. "So wherever you live, you'll always remember Maple Grove." Emma hugged her tightly. "I will." That afternoon, Walter drove Emma toward the farmhouse. Neither spoke very much. Sometimes, the happiest moments didn't need conversation. As they turned onto the long gravel driveway, Emma pressed her face against the window. "The sunflowers." Walter smiled. "They've grown." Emma laughed. "They are huge." They had good company. When the truck stopped, Emma jumped out before Walter could even open his door. She ran toward the front porch, then suddenly stopped. Walter looked concerned. "Everything all right?" Emma slowly turned around. "Can I really live here?" Walter smiled. "You'd better. I already made your room." Emma looked amazed. "You did? I've even got books. And puzzles. And—" He smiled mischievously. "A very serious squirrel problem." Emma burst into laughter. Inside, everything smelled of fresh bread and cinnamon. Sunlight poured through the living room windows. Emma carefully explored every room. She stopped when she reached the little bedroom. The yellow curtains fluttered gently in the breeze. The sunflower quilt covered the bed. Books filled the shelf. Her stuffed rabbit already rested on the pillow. Emma stood silently. Walter waited in the doorway. Finally, she whispered, "You made this. For me." Walter nodded. "I hoped you'd like it." Emma slowly walked across the room, then hugged him tighter than ever before. "It's the prettiest room I've ever had." Walter closed his eyes. Some prayers arrived very quietly. That evening, Emily came to visit with her husband and children. Emma stood nervously behind Walter. Emily smiled warmly. "You must be Emma." Emma nodded. "I'm Emily." She laughed. "I've been hearing about you for months." Emma looked surprised. "You have?" Emily grinned. "My dad talks about you. Every single phone call." Walter looked embarrassed. "I do not." Emily raised an eyebrow. "You absolutely do." Everyone laughed. The tension disappeared immediately. Emily's youngest son, Noah, walked over holding a baseball glove. "Do you want to play catch?" Emma hesitated. "I've never played." Noah smiled. "I'll teach you." Within minutes, the two children were laughing in the backyard. Walter watched from the porch. Emily quietly sat beside him. "You look happy." Walter smiled. "I forgot how noisy a house could be." Emily gently rested her head on his shoulder. "I think Mom would have loved this." Walter looked toward the setting sun. "I think she had something to do with it." As darkness settled across the farmhouse, Emma stood on the porch beside Walter. She looked toward the stars, then quietly asked, "Can I still call you Mr. Walter?" Walter smiled. "You can call me anything you like." Emma thought for a long moment, then softly whispered, "I'd rather call you Grandpa." Walter couldn't answer immediately. His eyes filled with tears. Finally, he smiled. "I'd like that very much." Emma slipped her hand into his, just as she had in the courtroom. This time, neither of them was afraid, because home had finally found them both. Spring arrived gently in Ashton Ridge. The sunflower garden outside Walter's farmhouse had begun to bloom again. Every morning, Emma hurried outside before breakfast. She checked each flower carefully, watered them, pulled tiny weeds from the soil, then smiled toward the tallest sunflower. "Good morning, Grandma." Walter never interrupted. Some conversations belonged only to the heart. Life slowly settled into a comfortable rhythm. School during the week, homework after dinner, Saturday grocery shopping, Sunday mornings at Maple Grove. Walter hadn't stopped visiting. He never intended to. The only difference now was that he had company. Emma came with him every Sunday. The residents loved her. Mrs. Evelyn could no longer remember Walter's name every week, but she never forgot Emma. "My little sunshine," she called her. Emma always smiled. "And you're my favorite storyteller." Mrs. Evelyn laughed. "I've been telling the same stories for 20 years. Emma shrugged. "I still like them." Frank taught Emma chess. He insisted she should learn from the better player. Walter protested. "You've been saying that for 12 years. Frank grinned, and one day it'll finally be true. 3 months later, Emma defeated Walter for the first time. Frank celebrated as though he'd won the championship himself. "I told you." Walter laughed. I've created two troublemakers. One afternoon, Emma asked Walter a question while they planted tomatoes in the garden. Grandpa, Walter smiled. I still like hearing that. Emma giggled. Can I ask something? Anything? Why didn't you ever get lonely? Walter stopped digging. He leaned on the shovel for a moment. I did. Emma looked surprised. You did? Walter nodded. Very often. He looked toward the porch where Alina's old rocking chair still sat. When Grandma Alina passed away, the house became very quiet. I thought silence would be the hardest part. Emma listened carefully, but it wasn't. What was? Walter smiled softly. Having no one to tell about my day. Emma quietly slipped her small hand into his. You can tell me. Walter's eyes became watery. I was hoping you would say that. A few weeks later, Emma's school announced Grandparents' Day. Every student could invite one grandparent to spend the afternoon together. Emma brought the permission slip home, then quietly placed it on the kitchen table. She didn't say anything. Walter noticed. Something wrong. Emma looked down. Do you think they'll let you come? Walter smiled. I suppose we could ask. The next morning, Walter visited the school office. The secretary smiled warmly. We'd love to have you. Walter hesitated. I'm not her biological grandfather. The principal happened to overhear. She walked over immediately, then smiled. Mr. Morgan. She gently placed the invitation back into his hands. Grandparents' Day celebrates the people who show up, not DNA. Walter smiled. I think Emma will like that answer. So do I. Grandparents' Day arrived on a bright Friday morning. The school gymnasium buzzed with excitement. Children proudly introduced grandparents. Some arrived with canes, others with walkers. Some carried homemade cookies. Some simply carried smiles. Walter wore his best navy sweater. Emma had brushed his hair twice before leaving home. You missed a spot, she insisted. Walter laughed. I've taught history for 40 years. No student ever cared about my hair. Emma folded her arms. They should have. When they entered the gym, several teachers recognized Walter immediately. Former students hurried over. Mr. Morgan. Walter smiled. Goodness, you've grown up. One laughed. You said that when I was 16. Walter chuckled. I was right then too. Emma looked amazed. You know everybody. Walter whispered. I've just been around a long time. The principal welcomed everyone, then announced a special activity. Each student would introduce their grandparent. One by one, children stood. This is my grandma. This is my grandpa. They taught me to fish. They bake cookies. They read stories. The room filled with laughter. Finally, the teacher smiled toward Emma. Emma, the little girl stood slowly. She looked around the crowded gym, then toward Walter. He smiled encouragingly. Emma took a deep breath, walked to the microphone. For a moment, she couldn't speak. The room became quiet. Walter worried she might be nervous. Then, Emma smiled. This, she looked proudly toward Walter, is my grandpa. Walter felt tears immediately. Emma continued. We're not related by blood. She paused, but she smiled even brighter. He came looking for lonely people, and somehow, he found me. Not a sound could be heard inside the gym. Emma continued. When my grandma died, I thought I'd lost my family. She looked at Walter, but Grandpa taught me that sometimes God sends you another one. Several teachers quietly wiped away tears. Parents reached for tissues. Even the principal lowered her head. Emma smiled through happy tears. My grandpa doesn't just visit nursing homes. He visits hearts. And she looked toward Walter one last time. I'm his granddaughter forever. The gymnasium erupted into applause. Not loud, not wild, just warm. The kind of applause people give when they witness something true. Walter slowly walked onto the stage. He hugged Emma tightly, then whispered, You've already given me the greatest gift. Emma looked up. What gift? Walter smiled. You made me a grandfather again. After the ceremony, an elderly man approached Walter. He had attended as another child's grandfather. He quietly introduced himself. My name is Richard. Walter shook his hand. Richard smiled sadly. My wife passed away last year. I've been living alone. Walter nodded gently. I understand. Richard looked toward Emma, laughing with her classmates. I've been thinking. I'd like to volunteer at Maple Grove. Walter smiled. They'd love to have you. Richard laughed softly. I guess it's never too late to become someone's grandpa. Walter looked toward the sunshine pouring through the school windows, then answered quietly, "No, it never is." That evening, Emma and Walter stopped by the sunflower garden before dinner. The tallest flower had opened completely. Emma gently touched one bright yellow pet. Grandma would have liked today. Walter smiled. I think she saw every minute of it. Emma looked up. You really think so? Walter nodded. I do. Emma smiled. So do I. The two of them stood quietly together, watching the sunflowers turn toward the evening light. Neither realized that the greatest chapter of their story was still waiting to be written. 5 years later, Sunday mornings still began the same way. At precisely 8:15, an old silver pickup turned into the parking lot of Maple Grove Nursing Home. Only now, Walter wasn't driving alone. 14-year-old Emma sat beside him, nearly as tall as Walter's shoulder. Her backpack rested between them. Inside, books, homework, and a small bag of homemade cookies. Ready? Walter asked. Emma smiled. When am I not? The automatic doors opened. Immediately, voices filled the hallway. They are here, my favorite visitors. Emma's back. Walter laughed. You've become more popular than I ever was. Emma grinned. That's because I bring cookies. Walter smiled. I knew there had to be a reason. Many of the faces had changed. Time had gently carried some residents home. New ones had arrived. Lonely, nervous, unsure whether anyone would remember their names. Walter always remembered. Emma did too. Mrs. Evelyn had passed peacefully 2 winters earlier. Frank had followed the next spring. Before he died, he had given Emma his old chessboard. A small brass plaque rested inside the lid. For my favorite student, beat your grandpa honestly next time. Frank. Emma still laughed every time she read it. Walter always answered. He cheated. Frank's memory still made both of them smile. Every Sunday, Emma continued the traditions. She read stories aloud, played piano in the recreation room, helped residents write letters, and every birthday, she baked a cake, exactly as Walter had done for years. One afternoon, a shy little boy wandered into the activity room. He couldn't have been older than 8. He sat alone near the window, watching everyone else. Emma noticed immediately. She quietly carried 2 cookies to his table. Hi. The boy looked nervous. My grandma lives here. Emma smiled. So did mine. He looked surprised. You still come? She nodded. Every Sunday. Why? Emma looked around the room, then answered with the words Walter had once spoken to her. Because nobody should feel forgotten. Walter heard every word. He smiled quietly. Some lessons didn't end with one generation. They continued, heart to heart. Later that afternoon, Walter sat alone beneath the old oak tree, outside the nursing home. His steps had become slower, his hair almost completely white. Emma walked over carrying 2 cups of tea. She handed one to him. Doctor says only 1 cup of coffee today. Walter sighed dramatically. I like the old doctor better. Emma laughed. He retired. Walter smiled. Everyone retires except me. Emma gently nudged his shoulder. I hope not. They watched the wind move through the sunflowers planted beside the entrance. There were dozens now. Residents had added more every spring. No one remembered exactly who planted the first one. Emma did. She never forgot. That evening, Walter looked unusually tired. Emily noticed. Dad, you all right? Walter smiled gently. Just getting older. Emily squeezed his hand. We all are. Walter looked toward Emma laughing with Noah in the backyard. I've been given 5 years. I never expected. Emily smiled. And she's been given a lifetime. As autumn returned, Walter's heart slowly became weaker. He never complained. He simply walked a little slower, rested a little longer, smiled exactly the same. Every Sunday, he still insisted on visiting Maple Grove. One October morning, Emma noticed him pausing halfway up the front steps. You okay, Grandpa? Walter smiled. Just catching my breath. She gently wrapped her arm around his. Then we'll catch it together. Walter laughed. I like that plan. Inside, they visited every resident, shared every cookie, listened to every story, just as they always had. When it was finally time to leave, Walter stopped beside the familiar chair near the window. The same chair, where Emma had first been waiting all those years before. He rested one hand on its back, then quietly whispered, "Thank you." Emma looked at him. "For what?" Walter smiled. "For changing my Sundays." A few weeks later, Walter passed away peacefully in his sleep. He was 81 years old. One hand rested upon the little blue and yellow bracelet Emma had made years before. The other held Alina's wedding ring. His face carried the same gentle smile he had worn every Sunday at Maple Grove. The funeral filled the largest church in Ashton Ridge. Former students, neighbors, teachers, doctors, nurses, families, children, residents from Maple Grove, even staff members from neighboring nursing homes attended. Some stood outside because every seat had already been taken. No one had organized it. People simply came because Walter had spent a lifetime showing up for them. Emma stood quietly beside the pulpit, now 14, confident, strong, carrying the same warmth Walter had once carried. She unfolded a single piece of paper, then looked toward the crowd. "My grandpa used to say, loneliness isn't cured by having more people around you. It's cured when one person chooses to stay." She paused, looking toward the empty chair placed beside the altar, the same wooden chair from Maple Grove, decorated with bright yellow sunflowers. Emma smiled through tears. "When I first met Grandpa, I thought I was waiting for someone who would never come." She looked toward the chair. "I didn't know. God had already sent him." The church grew completely silent. She continued, "My grandma taught me that sunflowers always turn toward the light. My grandpa taught me that people can become that light." She gently folded the paper, then smiled. "So today, I have an announcement." Several people looked up. Emma took a slow breath. "I've decided that after college, I'm coming back." She looked toward the nurses from Maple Grove. "I'm going to become a geriatric nurse." Tears appeared across the room. Emma continued, "And every Sunday, I'm going to keep visiting, just like Grandpa did." She pointed gently toward the wooden chair. "That chair will never be empty again." Several residents quietly nodded. They understood. The promise wasn't ending. It was simply changing hands. 10 years later, visitors entering Maple Grove noticed something unusual beside the activity room window. The old wooden chair remained exactly where it had always been. Next to it stood a bronze plaque. It read, "Walter Morgan, 1945-2026. He kept one simple promise. No one should ever feel forgotten." Below it, in smaller letters, another line had been added. "Every Sunday, someone still sits here." And they did. Sometimes Emma, sometimes children from the local school, sometimes former students, sometimes neighbors, sometimes strangers who had heard Walter's story. The chair was never empty, because one man's quiet promise had become an entire community's tradition. On warm spring mornings, the sunflowers outside Maple Grove still turned toward the light. And inside, someone was always listening, always smiling, always staying a few minutes longer, exactly as Walter once had. Because love, when shared faithfully, doesn't end with one life. It becomes a place where others learn to begin. Final reflection. If this story touched your heart, remember this: the family that changes your life may not share your last name. The grandfather you need may not be the one you were born with. And the greatest legacy any of us can leave behind is not money, or success, or recognition. It is knowing that because we showed up, someone else never had to feel forgotten again. Sometimes, the most important chair in the world is simply the one we choose not to leave empty.